I should start with some acknowledgements. I should pay my respects to the custodians of the land on which I live and work. And I do that for a particular reason today. In the slide, you'll see a view of Antinoopolis. And in the top right-hand corner, if you've got enough screen, you'll see me working as an epigrapher in the Kharga Oasis. And this reminds me very much that the exercise we're doing here is reading ancient text. And I'm reminded of a friend of mine with whom I worked in the Kharga Oasis. He was a geologist, really the worst sort of geologist, a hydrologist. And what he used to do was to measure the age of the groundwater. And he would say the groundwater is 20,000 years old. That was the normal date. We had no way of checking whether he was right. The people who live there think that the groundwater flows directly from the Nile, but it doesn't. It's been collected over thousands and thousands of years. I remember one day we were in the desert together, and he confided in me that he was about to have a sabbatical. And I said, what do you do with your sabbatical? And he said, I'm working on my first book. And I said, I didn't know you were writing a book. He said, forget writing it, I'm reading it. And that reminds me rather of the exercise that this is. Ancient text, somebody took a great deal of trouble and skill to write it. We bring a little skill to trying to read it and reconstruct it. We shouldn't overinflate our own tires. But there's a picture below that, which I hope you can see. It's a picture of the Juukan Gorge in Western Australia. Not as it is, but as it used to be about 2 weeks ago. And 20,000 years old groundwater and 40,000-year-old paintings and human occupation of those caves. So while I acknowledge the custodians of the land on which I work, I say with great shame that that's no longer there. And at the bottom, we've got the Ashmolean Museum, just to complete the acknowledgements. So this is the text that I want to talk about today, 928, Ralph's number 928. It's a very fragmentary text. And as such, we need to work carefully through methodologically how we approach it. There are about 30 fragments probably in total, and of those 30, relatively few are large. In this second slide, you'll see one of the larger ones. It's that one at the top left-hand side there, and a rather more typical one down at the bottom right-hand corner, if you can see it. And then one of the smaller ones right in the center, about there. The text has had a long history of editing. It was first edited, most of the fragments, by C.H. Roberts. And I mention him there in the list of contributors to this, this exercise of editing the text. Editing's not quite the word I want to use. I think there's a deal of reconstruction, a great deal of guesswork with a text like this. And what tends to happen, and certainly happened in this case, is that the whole process can readily go off the rails if we're not careful. And that's pretty much exactly what happened here. So I will want to describe in a moment the process of editing this text as compounding errors. Errors at the beginning which fed into all subsequent work, or almost all, to produce a view of this text which is 180 degrees wrong. Now that's not surprising perhaps when you think what we've got and what we haven't got here. But let me draw attention to a couple of features of the text to give you a sense of it. And I'm speaking now to that fragment that you see on the top left-hand corner. So you'll recognise that it's in Greek. It's a characteristic Greek hand of probably a bit after 200. We'll talk about the paleography briefly in a minute. You'll see that it's not very well preserved. We have, in this particular case, probably about a third of one column in width and a bit more than half a dozen lines. Notice that there's a gap in the text here. And that's an indication that this text is written in lines of sense, which we describe as stichometry. And it's one of the important features of this text that it's arranged in the way it is on the page, because there are at least two distinct stichometries of Proverbs, which this text is, known to us. And they're known in, those two are known in various Greek sources, in Syriac sources, in Coptic sources. I hazard they're known in Latin sources too, although I'm not absolutely sure of that. Two distinct stichometries of which this text represents one. And it's a feature of this type of text that many of the scribal characteristics tend to get lost sight of. You notice this paragraph marker here on the left, below the second line down. And then, of course, you'll all have noticed already the nomen sacrum here, anos for anthropos, which is characteristic of Septuagint texts, pretty much wherever you find them. By the way, we might discuss a little bit later the use of nomina sacra in Latin texts, about which some people on this call might know more than I do. I was struck the other day working on Leviticus, where we have multiple manuscripts, that there's a difference in the use of the nomina sacra between the two manuscripts. So elsewhere in this text, you get breathings and an occasional accent. And looking down at the bottom right-hand corner, Hugh, can you just tell me whether you can see that? So looking down at that bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a marginal note. And this is indicative of the scholarly context in which this text was first produced. And there must have been quite a few of these. We think we can pick them up at various points as we go along. So Roberts, then Zilliacus found some new fragments and did a re-edition of one of the folios. And then Gunther Zuntz reread the text based not on autopsy, but on what Roberts had first done. questioned some of Roberts's readings, questioned also the dating of the text, and argued that the text had affinities with Origen's Hexaplar. If that's the case, Origen died in 250, we're pushing it really with the paleography. But Zuntz was a bit inclined to date the text later rather than earlier. This is a sort of exercise in shoehorning in the sense that once you imagine what this text represents, then that's what you see. And that's what's happened with this text. Reconstructions have fitted a theory, and there isn't enough evidence to disprove it. And so a notion about what this text is developed from there. I talk for a minute about the unplaced fragments. Always interesting with this type of situation is the fragments that the first editor couldn't place. Constantly surprises me how many of these fragments you can find when you're looking in editions, first editions, but rarely does anybody come along later and fill in the gaps. So I was very interested in the unplaced fragments, and because I can't get into a library now, I couldn't get a clean copy of this, but you can see my original work on the 4 unplaced fragments. Fragment 21 was very easy to identify, really. As you might imagine, you can see some characteristic words that should be easy to find. Fragment 24, we placed almost immediately. It joins existing text. Fragment 23, I'm still working on, and fragment 22, I think I know where it goes, but I'm not saying. Here you see the identification of the recto of fragment this one. Actually, oh, I'm not sure. Oh, that one. So there's your ape, and there's your ape there. But one of the reasons I think that wasn't successfully identified was that, as you'll see from the verse numbers 9b, 9c, 23, so that represents a reordering of the text, which made it a little bit difficult to identify. I won't say much about the orthography, the paleography, but notice that that in this particular case, you might have your own suspicions about whether these 2 fragments belong to the same hand. I do, but they were put together by the original editor, and I think that's caused some problems too. And it would be good for this to be re-examined. So we'll go over to the next slide, because this is where I think the thing gets interesting. If I go back here for a moment, you'll see a gap up in this top corner here. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see the gap's been filled. And it's been filled with this fragment here. And this is one of half a dozen fragments that when I went to the Ashmolean, to the papyrological workroom, I found in the box of inedita. So that was quite an exciting day, as you might imagine, to almost excavate new fragments. Because Zilliacus had found quite a lot of new fragments, we thought that I thought that there might be a few more to be found. This is one of them. It's that one there. and you'll see really the hand is very characteristic. And this is another, and it's so obviously part of the text that it's surprising that it went missing in the box and was never originally edited. Now, finding such small fragments and trying to identify them normally leads to the demonstration of that maxim that the more you, the less interesting a text is, the easier it is to identify. And it almost turned out to be that way with this too. This one's not particularly interesting. Doesn't tell us much about the text that we don't already know. But this one was quite the opposite and produced a stunning result. This is my thumb, by the way. I wanted this for scale. I said somewhere that this fragment is about the size of a thumb nail, and so it is, but that's because I've scaled it. But it's particularly textually interesting. When Roberts and Zuntz were faced with this kappa and omicron, the best they could do was to say, well, it looks like these two lines here, whatever they contained, have been reversed because omicron might have stood there and kappa in the standard Septuagint. Well, that was a guess that wasn't worthy of printing, really. But I suppose they had to say something. In any case, when they guessed that that might have been what had happened, they were only demonstrating that if you don't know, you don't know. Here, you've got the rather marvelous then addition of this fragment, which demonstrates that this had the line that we think it might have had from the Septuagint, and there's an entirely new line in here, which isn't in any Septuagint manuscript at all. Now, Roberts can't have been expected to find that. He was working from Holmes Parsons, but Holmes Parsons doesn't contain it, but neither does any other Greek text that we know of. So for the first time, this line of Greek comes to light, and it comes to light with an interest for us that is particular because of the relationship to the versions. So I've given it here. This is, shall I go over the page? This is Staatsbibliothek Berlin manuscript OCT 987, and there's a full page of it. It's a square codex, which is interesting in its own right, and there's a rather lovely digital reproduction of it available to you these days, and I've snapped a little piece out of it. 3 lines with my original annotations from way back then, and this line corresponding to this line in Greek. And then just to make it very exciting and relevant to today, perhaps, what does this line mean? Well, it means pretty much exactly what that line means in Latin. So, hare nefer hode te en Rome resce, and is more or less thesauri autem eius faciunt homines gaudiabundos. But here then you see the theta eta, which was the giveaway really for where this should go. It's the Greek word thesauroi, which is, if it's fair to say, transliterated in Latin, represented by nefer ho there in that Achmimic text. I gave you the Achmimic because it's probably the earliest we've got. So I can skip now to here, and I'm pretty sure you won't be able to read everything I've written here, but because I can't even myself, but I can talk you through it. So how do we explain a Coptic text agreeing with a Latin where there's no Greek that we know of at all? Well, it would seem a bit of a strange phenomenon, but it isn't actually that strange at all. And I draw your attention to the analogy of the Upper Egyptian text of Psalms. So you see this with a number of witnesses, including two important Coptic manuscripts, which are well known. They're completely well known. Actually, there's quite a few Greek texts of the Psalter which represent this text type as well. They're also well known and extensive and overlapping in a useful way, so they cover almost the entire Psalter. About the Latin, well, we discussed that complication briefly last week in the seminar, and I'm still wondering whether in what way the various Latins of the Psalter relate to the Upper Egyptian text, shall I express it that way? In any case, it's the same, pretty much the same phenomenon. Ralph says of it that it's a very ancient text, and as such goes back behind the common Septuagint of the 4th century. And so, generally speaking, I think what this represents for us is the view that there wasn't a single Septuagint that simply flowed through the prism of Origen and his recensional activity to produce the current Septuagint. Neither was it just a matter of various other translations filtering in, but there were other known Septuagints, and they were ancient. And they may have been extremely early. And I write at the bottom, are the Coptics and the Latin in any sense strange bedfellows? So it may appear to you as an oddity. I'd be interested to know whether it does. That the Coptic and the Latin come together at this point, producing and preserving a text which we don't know in Greek at all. And I think that may have its explanation in the Coptic and the Latin being independently early witnesses of a very early text. And if I may strain the friendship for a moment, I wonder whether both the Coptic and the Latin, just like the Septuagint, have Jewish origins.
Super, Geoff. Thank you very much indeed for a thought-provoking presentation. I shall do the traditional thing of unmuting everybody if I find the button to express our appreciation. So we have time for questions, which you've carefully left us. Again, if people want to wave if you've got your video on, or raise your hand in the participants window, or Michael, I can see you waving. You're unmuted. You should be unmuted.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much. It's really helpful, interesting. And I suppose a couple of things. One, I think you do occasionally see in Sirach, which is a book I know a little bit more about than I do about Proverbs, which is still very little, but you do occasionally see times when a number of versions agree with each other against no Greek evidence. And I suppose I don't think that should astonish us for the reasons you give, that it's quite possible that the Coptic and the Latin are independent early witnesses to a Greek text now lost. Why does that push you in favour of Jewish origins of the Latin and the Coptic? And could you say more about that? You're muted, I think, sorry.
Thank you. So thank you, Michael. I have felt for a long time that that this type of example indicates an early, that is earlier than 2nd century and maybe even earlier than that, origin for the Latin in Jewish circles. So this overlap between the Coptic and the Latin in some sense pushes that further back, because there's no, if a text is not well known, then it gets into translation into two translations in a similar form at an earlier stage, I think is the argument. If it gets early enough, then it may not be a Christian translation. And I think there's an argument for that for certain Coptic dialects especially. If there is such a phenomenon as Latin-speaking Hellenistic Judaism in North Africa, then that will be the origin of some of those translations as well.
And is there evidence? I mean, I don't know much about this, I'm really sorry, but is there significant independent evidence of Latin-speaking Hellenistic Judaism in North Africa from the right time?
Well, I think there is, but we don't notice it as much as we should, I think. And I'd be inclined to argue this in terms of the books that are preserved. So 4th Ezra, for example, not a lot of evidence for Christian interest in 4th Ezra, but a very good, well-preserved Latin text of it. One of our issues is that the archaeology of North Africa has tended to write a Jewish presence out, and I think much of what we've discovered may have been Jewish, but we didn't realize it. And this can especially be true of Septuagint texts, where it's the presumption is that it's a Christian text unless it's, well, it just is. And the whole debate about nomina sacra demonstrates that how tendentious we can easily become in that regard. But I hesitate to make too much of the argument about the Latin. I wanted to throw it in because it was relevant to this audience, I think. But this began life as comments about the Coptic more than that.
Super, thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Christina was next with her questions, so would you ask that, please?
Well, thank you very much for that. That was really interesting. And I have one short comment and one question. And the short comment is that this Coptic and the Coptic and Latin connection is really interesting. And I do remember from the SBL meeting when the Editio Critica Maya of Acts was presented, that our colleagues from Münster and Sigrid Richter for the Coptic department said something similar about the Coptic and the Latin for Acts. And he said that they haven't gone into it as far as I recall, and that there will be more to do and more research that someone should do. So maybe there will be much more in that department. So I find it exciting what you said. But my question is more, sorry, again, also on the Latin side for the word gaudibundus. I think that's rather rare, and I was wondering whether, I mean, maybe it's common with that sort of text, but whether it says something about the age of the text or anything like that. Sorry about asking another Latin question, but that's where.
No apology needed, not at all. It's very intriguing, isn't it, how difficult it is to bring those exercises and researches that belong together and reflect on each other. It can be difficult to get them onto the same page and into the same room. Roberts says of this text, I don't know any Coptic, but I asked somebody to look at it and they told me it has nothing to do with the Coptic. Well, that was a procedural error, I think. But it wouldn't surprise me for a moment if you got overlaps of Coptic and Latin, and even we were discussing this last week, weren't we? The possibility that the versions would represent a text that we don't have in Greek. We just overstate, I think, so often how significant what's preserved for us is. On the Latin, I think I'd answer that on the age of the Latin. I'd answer that with a comment about the Coptic, really. That is to say, if you now sat down and said, okay, the Coptic text of Proverbs tells us something significant about Proverbs that we don't know in Greek. Let's pursue it. Let's go right through it and see what we can discover. A big exercise, major task to do. And I think the same is true now of the Latin of Proverbs. We need to do that same exercise. It's a very substantial task for someone with expertise that I don't have, but and the age of the translation, such an interesting observation you make, and I'm having a sleep after this, but after that, I'll start it.
I think certainly some of the comments about the Old Latin books in the Old Testament suggest they go back a very long way, but the work needs to be done, as you say, and it's a lot of work to bring that together. I must confess, I thought that the Latin phrase you had on that about the riches of the treasuries and the joys they brought was a reference to the time you spent in the Ashmolean and the treasury of Fragments you had to join from that. So I was quite dumbfounded when it turned out to be a bit of Proverbs. I think we're that probably is the sort of allocated time we have for questions now, but I'm sure that Geoff will be glad to correspond by email if there are further things to be picked up from his presentation today. So once again, we'll express our appreciation to Geoff and thank you also for attending so faithfully each week.